Women without a voice who revealed their incest scars in Alabama. America's most brutal secret. This is a tale buried for nearly 7 decades in the depths of the Appalachian Hills. A narrative of how extreme poverty and geographical isolation forged conditions for practices that defied the fundamental principles of modern society. Back in 1953, within the dense forests of Clayborn County, Alabama, existed a community forgotten by time. The Harmon family lived on a 15-hectare property, isolated for generations, situated over 40 kilometers from the nearest town. The dirt path leading to their land was nearly impossible to traverse in winter, with the closest neighbors miles away. Joseph Harmon, the family patriarch, established an unbreakable rule that spanned 3 generations: Harmon blood stays with the Harmons. This philosophy led to a series of unions between cousins, uncles and nieces, and even siblings, creating a genetic puzzle that would later be examined by doctors and geneticists from across the nation. The story broke when a 19-year-old Martha Harmon walked 27 kilometers to the county hospital in 1953, carrying her newborn daughter who had obvious deformities. Martha could barely speak, not because she was hesitant, but because she had never learned to communicate properly with anyone outside her family. Her vocabulary was limited to fewer than 200 words, and her grasp of the outside world was practically non-existent. Dr. William Carson, the physician on duty that rainy October night, noted in his medical journal, the young woman presented in a state of extreme malnutrition and showed signs of prolonged neglect. The infant in her arms had cranial malformation, clubbed fingers, and other signs consistent with conditions resulting from consanguinity. What nobody knew that night was that Martha was more than just a concerned mother. She was the first woman to break free from a cycle that had entrapped 3 generations of Harmon women. Her escape was an act of extraordinary courage, driven not by a scientific understanding of inbreeding's consequences, but by a primal instinct to protect her daughter. Subsequent inquiries revealed the Harmon family had established this dynamic of isolation since the Great Depression. It began when Joseph Harmon's father lost his entire fortune and decided the outside world was not to be trusted. What started as isolation for economic reasons morphed into a life philosophy preaching the purity of Harmon blood. 37 children were born on the Harmon property, of which only 19 survived to adolescence. Official records were non-existent. Many of these children were never documented. Those who survived often suffered from cognitive deficiencies, physical deformities, and developmental issues. Social worker Eleanor Wright, assigned to the case in November 1953, wrote in her report, "The women of the Harmon family exist under conditions that defy any modern concept of human dignity. Treated as property, they are kept in a state of deliberate ignorance about the world beyond." The patriarch, Joseph Harmon, controls every facet of family life, including with whom each member can form relationships. The initial investigation uncovered that Martha was the daughter of Joseph Harmon and his own first cousin, Emily Harmon. The baby she carried was the result of a union with her half-brother, Robert Harmon, who was 12 years her senior. This pattern of consanguineous relationships was not the exception, but the established rule within the family for generations. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel. These stories document hidden chapters of American history you won't find in school textbooks, uncovering truths many would prefer stay buried. Don't miss a single episode of this series, which is bringing to light rural America's darkest secrets. Martha's arrival at the hospital set off a chain of events that would culminate in the largest consanguinity investigation Alabama had ever seen. Authorities, initially hesitant to interfere in what they considered private family matters, were forced to act when Dr. Carson presented irrefutable medical evidence of the harm caused by the Harmon family's practices. In December 1953, a team of social workers, doctors, and state law representatives made the first official visit to the Harmon property. What they discovered shocked even the most seasoned professionals. The property housed 7 rudimentary cabins with no electricity or running water. Primitive sanitary conditions and signs of extreme poverty were everywhere. A 67-year-old Joseph Harmon greeted the visitors with a shotgun in his hands. Flanking him were his 2 eldest sons, both showing clear signs of cognitive disabilities. "This is Harmon land. We don't recognize your authority here," were his first words, according to the official report. The negotiation lasted for hours until social worker Eleanor Wright managed to persuade Joseph to allow a brief inspection, on the condition that no one would be taken by force. What the team documented in the following hours would form the foundation for one of Alabama's most significant cases of state intervention in an isolated community. 27 people lived on the property, all related by blood in varying degrees. The women, in particular, showed signs of severe social isolation. Many could barely form complete sentences and displayed extreme distrust toward the outsiders. 5 children under 10 years old had obvious physical deformities, including polydactyly, extra fingers, underdeveloped jaws, and cranial deformities. A preliminary medical report signed by Dr. Carson stated, "The effects of consanguinity are evident across multiple generations. We observed a high incidence of cataracts, developmental delays, and cognitive issues. The situation is worsened by a lack of prenatal care, chronic malnutrition, and the complete absence of formal education." The case took on a new dimension when the team discovered a diary belonging to Sarah Harmon, Martha's aunt and one of the few women in the family who had received some formal education before the total isolation began. Sarah, who died in 1949, had meticulously documented her observations on family births and Harmon ailments, as she called the conditions afflicting many children. A particularly disturbing entry from 1941 revealed, "I buried my 4th unnamed child today. He was born like the others, with a head too small and unable to breathe properly. Joseph says it is God testing our faith. But I'm starting to suspect something is wrong with our blood. When I mention it, he becomes furious and says Harmon blood is the purest in America." Sarah's diary would become a crucial piece in understanding the family dynamics and the subsequent legal case. It was the first documented evidence that at least one family member was aware of the consequences of inbreeding, even without fully grasping the scientific mechanisms. In January 1954, authorities returned to the Harmon property with a court order to examine all the children. Joseph Harmon resisted violently, leading to his temporary arrest. This intervention allowed doctors to properly examine the younger family members, revealing the full extent of the damage caused by decades of consanguineous unions. Geneticist Dr. Howard Jensen from the University of Alabama was called in to study the case. His preliminary report, published in March 1954, would be cited in medical studies for decades. The Harmon family represents an extreme case of inbreeding depression, the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes resulting from continuous close-kin unions. We observed a 400% higher incidence of congenital anomalies compared to the general population, growing more severe with each generation. Meanwhile, Martha and her daughter remained under medical care. The young woman slowly began to expand her vocabulary and understanding of the world. In sessions with psychologists, she gradually revealed details of life on the Harmon property, a rigid hierarchy where women were considered property, education was forbidden, and any challenge to family traditions was severely punished. By the spring of 1954, the Harmon case had become a turning point for public policies concerning isolated communities in Alabama. Revelations about the family's practices sparked intense debates on the limits of state intervention in traditional communities, pitting the right to family self-determination against the welfare of vulnerable individuals. The situation grew even more complex when 3 other Harmon women, Jessie, 32, Rebecca, 27, and Laura, 23, followed Martha's lead and sought help from the authorities. Their stories, painstakingly pieced together over months of interviews with specialized psychologists, painted an even more disturbing picture of life on the property. Jessie Harmon, who had given birth to 7 children, only 2 of whom survived past their first year, described in her testimony how women were systematically kept ignorant. Pa Joseph said reading spoiled a woman's womb. Anyone caught trying to learn letters was locked in a dark cabin for days. After a while, we just stopped trying. Rebecca, who had a mild cognitive deficiency, revealed how the isolation was enforced. We had bells hidden on the main road. When someone approached, everyone hid in the caves. The children were taught from a young age to fear outsiders, who, Joseph said, wanted to steal our land and break up our family. The most impactful testimony came from Laura, who had managed to hide and preserve some of her mother Sarah's diary pages. These fragments revealed that as early as 1937, Sarah Harmon had begun to question the family's practices after losing 4 children to severe congenital malformations. If you are watching this story and feel the pain of these women who never had a voice, leave a comment saying, "They deserve to be heard." Show that you stand with those who have been silenced by history. A particularly revealing diary excerpt from 1942 stated, "I tried to talk to Joseph about getting help from town for our sickly babies. He was furious, saying our problems started when I let strangers examine me during my difficult delivery in 39. He said they contaminated our blood with their impure hands and that the solution was to become even more isolated." The medical team, led by Dr. Jensen, conducted preliminary genetic studies using the techniques of the time, like blood group analysis and phenotypic characteristic assessment. Their findings, though limited by 1950s science, were enough to document clear patterns of deleterious recessive gene expression. The report indicated, "We observed an abnormally high concentration of rare recessive conditions, including atypical achondroplasia, microcephaly, and a Pierre-Robin-like syndrome." The family structure created a perfect environment for these genetic traits to manifest, traits that would typically remain hidden in more genetically diverse populations. The condition of the children born on the property became the main focus of medical and legal concern. Of the 19 children under 18 found on the land, 14 had some degree of physical or cognitive impairment. 3 required constant care due to severe conditions. The legal system faced an unprecedented dilemma: how to balance traditional parental rights with the protection of children. Judge Harold Blackwood, overseeing the case, captured this tension in his notes. "We are confronted with a case that challenges our most fundamental principles. On one side, we have the tradition of non-interference in family practices. On the other, we have undeniable medical evidence of preventable harm being perpetuated across generations." In June 1954, after months of evaluations and testimony, the Clayborn County Court issued a historic ruling. Joseph Harmon and his 2 eldest sons were found legally responsible for systematic neglect and for creating conditions harmful to the minors' healthy development. The children were temporarily placed under state protection, and the adult women were given the choice to stay on the property or seek help for social reintegration. The case set a major legal precedent, recognizing for the first time in Alabama that traditional family practices could be limited when they resulted in proven physical harm to children. The decision was controversial, with some religious groups and traditional rights advocates protesting what they saw as government overreach. Meanwhile, Martha, now in a rehabilitation center with her daughter, was making remarkable progress. Within 7 months, her vocabulary had grown to over 800 words, and she displayed a learning capacity that surprised experts, challenging initial assumptions about her cognitive potential. Martha's daughter, named Hope by the hospital staff, received treatment for her congenital conditions. Despite physical limitations, including clubbed fingers and jaw formation issues, she showed normal responsiveness and cognitive development for her age. By the fall of 1954, the Harmon case had catalyzed systemic changes in how Alabama addressed isolated communities and potential consanguinity. The Department of Public Health created a special program to identify and monitor remote, high-risk communities, with a focus on the Appalachian mountain region. The Harmon property was placed under special supervision, with regular visits from social workers and health professionals. Joseph Harmon, after serving a 6-month sentence, returned to the property under strict conditions, including allowing regular access for authorities and a prohibition on interfering with the children's education. The 4 women who sought help, Martha, Jessie, Rebecca, and Laura, became the subjects of a longitudinal study by the University of Alabama. This study, initially planned for 5 years, would ultimately extend for 2 decades, tracking their social adaptation and the challenges of leaving extreme isolation. Dr. Elizabeth Townsend, the psychologist accompanying the Harmon women, documented, "We observed a fascinating phenomenon of accelerated cognitive recovery, particularly in Martha and Laura, who were deprived of intellectual and social stimulation their entire lives. They demonstrated a remarkable capacity to absorb new knowledge and concepts when finally placed in an enriching environment. Martha, in particular, showed astounding evolution. By 1956, just 2 years after leaving, she had not only learned basic reading and writing but had also developed vocational skills, allowing her to work as an assistant at a local daycare. Her daughter, Hope, then 3, received specialized treatments and showed steady progress, surpassing many of the limitations initially predicted by doctors. Sarah Harmon's diary, recovered in fragments through Laura's efforts, became an object of intense study. Historians and anthropologists began tracing the family's trajectory, revealing a story of progressive isolation that began not with ancestral beliefs about blood purity, as Joseph claimed, but with specific economic and social circumstances. Historian Dr. Robert Fleming, analyzing municipal and census records, found that the Harmons had been a prosperous, well-integrated family until the 1920s. Joseph Harmon's father was a respected merchant and trader until a series of financial missteps and the Great Depression wiped out most of their wealth. The family's retreat to the remote property coincided with accusations of fraud against the elder Joseph in 1928, Fleming wrote. What began as an escape from creditors and social shame evolved, over a single generation, into a complete ideology of isolation, justified by pseudo-religious beliefs about purity and a deep distrust of the outside world. This historical context was crucial. It showed how a previously conventional family could, in just 2 generations, develop such extreme practices. It was not mere ancient ignorance, but a distorted response to real social and economic trauma, amplified by progressive isolation. In 1957, the Harmon case gained national attention when the Journal of Medical Genetics published Dr. Jensen's preliminary study. The article, Phenotypic Consequences of Prolonged Consanguinity, the Harmon case, meticulously documented the patterns of genetic inheritance observed over 3 generations. The study found an incidence of rare recessive conditions 27 times higher in the Harmon lineage than in the general population. Particularly significant was the documentation of how certain conditions grew progressively worse in subsequent generations, a phenomenon Jensen termed inbreeding amplification. In normal populations, the article explained, deleterious recessive genes rarely express themselves because the chance of 2 carriers reproducing is statistically low. In the Harmon family, this probability increased exponentially with each generation of consanguineous marriage, resulting in an unprecedented concentration of manifested deleterious alleles. The publication sparked intense ethical debates in the medical and legal communities. Fundamental questions were raised. What is the appropriate limit for state intervention in family practices? How do we balance respect for cultural traditions with the protection of vulnerable individuals? What socio-economic factors contribute to the emergence and maintenance of consanguinity? While these debates raged in academic and political circles, the Harmon women continued their journeys of adaptation and recovery. Jessie, the eldest of the 4, eventually decided to return to the property in 1958, but with a crucial difference: she became a mediator between the family and the authorities, ensuring the remaining children had access to education and medical care. Rebecca and Laura chose to remain in town, where they actively participated in the rehabilitation program. By 1960, both had secured formal employment and independent housing, extraordinary achievements given their origins. Their case proved that even after decades of extreme isolation, social reintegration was possible with the right support. The story of the Harmon family continued to unfold over the following decades, offering valuable insights into the long-term effects of both consanguinity and intervention. In 1963, a 10-year follow-up study by Dr. Jensen's team documented the medical and social outcomes of the Harmon children. Of the 14 children with congenital conditions identified in 1954, 9 showed significant improvement with proper treatment and stimulation. 3 remained with severe limitations requiring continuous care, and 2 had sadly died from complications related to congenital heart malformations. The Harmon property underwent gradual transformations. Joseph Harmon died in 1966 at the age of 80, and with him, much of the ideological resistance to the outside world faded. His older sons, though initially reluctant, eventually allowed greater integration with the surrounding community. Martha Harmon, whose brave escape in 1953 started it all, became a remarkable figure in her own right. By 1967, after years of self-education, she began giving occasional lectures to social work professionals about her experience. Her unique perspective, having lived on both sides of the divide, offered invaluable insights for those working with isolated communities. In a particularly impactful 1972 speech to social work students, Martha reflected, "Many people ask me if I feel anger about how I grew up. The truth is more complicated. My father and the older men genuinely believed they were protecting us. The isolation began with a real fear of the outside world. The problem wasn't evil, but ignorance, perpetuated through generations, born from fear and solidified by pride." This nuance in Martha's understanding significantly influenced subsequent approaches to similar cases. Instead of simply condemning, authorities developed more collaborative strategies, focusing on education and medical assistance as entry points. Martha's daughter, Hope, whose condition had been the initial catalyst for seeking help, grew up exceeding many of her initial limitations. Though she continued to face physical challenges, including partially clubbed fingers and mandibular issues requiring multiple surgeries, she developed normal cognitive capabilities and graduated high school in 1972, an achievement that had once seemed impossible. In 1975, the Harmon case received renewed attention when the U.S. Congress held hearings on isolated communities and the risks of consanguinity as part of broader rural public health initiatives. Jesse and Martha Harmon were invited to testify, offering complementary perspectives on how to best help similar communities. Jess's testimony was particularly powerful. "We are not here to condemn our parents or our upbringing. We are here to say that there are children in this country, right now, living as we lived. They don't know there's a world beyond the mountains. They don't know they don't have to marry their cousins or siblings. They don't know their children don't need to be born with the Harmon ailments, as we called them." The recommendations from these hearings led to the creation of medical and educational extension programs specifically for geographically isolated communities, using culturally sensitive approaches that respected local traditions while offering alternatives and scientific information. The academic legacy of the Harmon case was equally significant. The genetic studies begun by Dr. Jensen served as a foundation for later research on the effects of consanguinity. Even as more advanced genetic techniques emerged, the data from the Harmon case continued to offer valuable insights into the patterns of recessive gene inheritance and expression. In 1983, 30 years after the initial events, the Journal of Genetic Counseling published a retrospective article tracking the descendants of the Harmon family. The study revealed that with the cessation of consanguineous marriages, the next generation experienced a dramatic reduction in the incidence of congenital conditions, a practical demonstration of the principles of genetic diversity that are now foundational to population genetics. The case also set important legal precedents for balancing family privacy with necessary intervention to protect the vulnerable. Judicial decisions from the Harmon case were later cited in over 40 other cases involving child neglect in contexts of cultural or religious isolation. Martha Harmon passed away in 1998 at the age of 64. Her obituary in the local newspaper highlighted not just her extraordinary personal journey, but her lasting impact on public policy and medical practice. "Martha was not merely a survivor," the editor wrote. "She transformed her experience into a beacon, illuminating the dark corners of our society where other families still live in similar isolation." Hope, who adopted the surname Collins after marrying in 1976, carried on her mother's legacy. She graduated with a degree in social work and specialized in assisting isolated rural communities, bringing education and information about genetic health to places where such resources were scarce. Her work was recognized with a State Public Service Award in 2001. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Be sure to subscribe to learn about other historical cases hidden for decades. Your like is critical for this story to reach more people. Share it with anyone you think needs to know this dark part of American history that few have the courage to tell. The story of the Harmon women reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of our collective history, there are individuals whose exceptional courage can break cycles that have persisted for generations. Martha, Jesse, Rebecca, and Laura were not just victims of circumstance, they were agents of transformation. By seeking help, They not only changed their own destinies and those of their children but also contributed to systemic changes that benefited countless other families in similar situations. The most important legacy of the Harmon case is not found in the scientific studies or legal precedents it established, but in the simple, profound fact that thanks to the courage of these women who found their voices after decades of silence, children who would have been born into isolation and inbreeding were given the chance for a different life, a life of choices, possibilities, and horizons stretching far beyond the Alabama mountains.